They'd called me heartless for refusing to fund my brother's dream wedding, but none of them knew the clause in Grandpa's will that I'd kept secret for years. I never thought I'd see the day when my parents would side with someone who barely knew our family over their firstborn daughter, but here I was, standing in my childhood living room facing Oliver, my younger brother, and his picture-perfect fiancée, Vanessa, while my mom dabbed her eyes dramatically and Dad asked me to just be reasonable. As a reasonable, Vanessa had just demanded that I give up half of my inheritance from Grandpa, a trust fund I couldn't even touch until I turned 30, and only under specific conditions, all so they could afford a 200-guest beachfront wedding and a down payment on a condo in Miami. And when I said no, they acted like I'd burned the house down. What stunned me most wasn't Vanessa's entitled audacity, it was the silence that followed. The way Oliver looked away, the way my parents exchanged glances, then said, "We just want to keep the family together." That was the moment I realized I was no longer the daughter, the sister, the one who helped hold this family up when no one else would. I was the obstacle, and I wasn't about to let them bulldoze me quietly. There was a time when I would have given anything for Oliver. We weren't just siblings, we were best friends. I was 2 years older, but we grew up more like twins. I taught him how to ride a bike, how to climb the old oak tree behind the bakery, and how to sneak the perfect cookie without getting caught by Mom. We had our secret codes, our midnight whispers, and a shared belief that nothing could break us. Our parents, Margaret and David, owned a small-town bakery. Not glamorous, not wildly successful, but full of warmth. I spent most of my childhood behind that counter, learning the difference between croissants and danishes, how to smile even when your feet ached, and that love often came in the form of extra icing on your cinnamon roll. When Mom was diagnosed with early-stage cancer during my junior year of high school, it was me, not Oliver, who stepped up. I deferred college. I gave up a partial scholarship to a state university because Dad needed help keeping the business afloat, and Mom couldn't manage chemo and ovens at the same time. Oliver cried when I told him. "You're giving up your dream," he said. I smiled and said, "It's not gone, just delayed." Truth is, I didn't think twice. The family came first, always. And for a long time, I truly believed we all lived by that rule. Oliver had it easier. He was the golden boy, the natural charmer. Teachers loved him, neighbors adored him, and my parents, well, they doted on him like he hung the stars. When he got a C in math, it was because the teacher didn't explain things clearly. When I got an A, it was, "You should have studied harder." But I didn't mind, not then. I was proud of him. I thought we were on the same team. When he got into a fancy liberal arts school out east, my parents threw a party. I baked the cake. I strung up the lights in the backyard. I even helped Vanessa, his then girlfriend, pick out a gift to surprise him with. I remember watching them together thinking, this is it. We're all moving forward now. Meanwhile, I stayed behind. I managed the bakery full-time, taking over payroll and vendor negotiations. By the time I turned 21, when Mom relapsed, I took her to every appointment. I learned how to administer injections when she didn't want to go back to the hospital. I watched Dad break down in the pantry one night when he thought no one could hear, and I held him until he stopped shaking. Oliver visited when he could, always full of bright stories from campus. He was grateful, he said. "You're the glue, Liz. This place would fall apart without you." Sometimes he'd hug me and call me his hero. I held on to those moments like prayer beads. When Grandpa passed, it was sudden. He had a heart attack in his sleep. He'd always been a quiet presence in our lives, distant but dignified. What I didn't know until the reading of the will was that he'd left a trust in my name, not in Oliver's. Just mine. It wasn't extravagant, but it was enough to finally chase the dream I'd put on hold. A cozy art studio downtown, or maybe a pastry shop of my own, one with my name above the door instead of someone else's. The terms were strict. I couldn't touch the money until I was 30. It had to be used for education, home ownership, or business investment. Grandpa knew me. He knew I wouldn't squander it. That trust felt like someone had finally seen all the silent sacrifices I made and said, "You matter too." I never told anyone the full details, just said it wasn't available yet. Even then, a part of me feared what might happen if the wrong people knew. Still, I kept showing up for my family. I made the birthday cakes, organized the anniversary dinners, and stayed late at the bakery even when I had migraines. And when Oliver proposed to Vanessa in our backyard with twinkle lights and a 5-piece jazz band, I cheered the loudest. Because back then I still believed we were in this together. I still believed love was enough. The first sign should have been the guest list. Vanessa had taken over wedding planning with the kind of energy usually reserved for political campaigns. She printed itineraries for family dinners, hired a social media assistant to manage their couple's Instagram, and referred to Oliver as my brand partner more often than my fiancé. At one of our Sunday dinners, she handed out glossy, monogrammed save the dates, even though the wedding was still 10 months away. I wasn't surprised to find my name near the bottom of the family list. What caught me off guard was the note attached. "Eliza, would you be willing to make cupcakes for the reception? We're doing a rustic chic dessert table, and I know you can make it look professional, but still, homey." No mention of compensation, no discussion, just an assumption. I told her I'd think about it. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek like we were best friends, and whispered, "This is going to be so good for your little bakery. Exposure, you know?" That word made my stomach turn, but it didn't stop there. At a dinner a few weeks later, while we were passing plates around the table, Vanessa tilted her head and said, "So, Eliza, what are you planning to do with that little inheritance you got? Oliver mentioned you had something tucked away." I froze. My fork hovered above the mashed potatoes, and every eye turned to me. Dad coughed. Mom suddenly needed to refill the water pitcher. Oliver just looked down at his plate. I shrugged and said, "It's not really something I can use yet. It's tied up for a while." "Oh, I see," Vanessa replied, sipping her wine. "Still, it's so nice to have a safety net, right? Not everyone gets that. Oliver and I were just saying how helpful something like that would be for starting fresh." I nodded politely, but inside, a tiny alarm bell started ringing. That dinner was the beginning of a slow, calculated campaign. At every family event after that, Vanessa would find some way to bring it up, always casually, always with a smile. One afternoon, while helping Mom decorate cookies for Valentine's Day orders, she said, "I mean, it's kind of beautiful, right? That your grandfather believed in you enough to invest in your future. Some people might say the best way to honor that would be to use it for something really meaningful, like helping family." Mom didn't say anything. She just kept piping hearts onto the sugar cookies like she hadn't heard. Another time at a family barbecue, she leaned in while we were grabbing sodas from the cooler and said, "If I had a trust fund, I'd use it to create memories, like an epic wedding, something people would talk about for generations, not to buy a studio that might fail in a year." That time I didn't answer, I just walked away. It wasn't just Vanessa. Oliver started chiming in too, more subtle but just as manipulative. "You're so good with money, Liz," he'd say. "I mean, come on, it's just sitting there, you wouldn't even miss it." Or, "Vanessa's under a lot of stress right now, she just wants to feel like she's part of the family." That line kept coming up. So often, in fact, that I started to wonder if it had been rehearsed. I finally brought it up with my parents, expecting maybe just a little backup. I thought Dad would say something like, "We'll talk to them," or Mom would give me that tired smile and say, "Just ignore her, honey." But instead, Mom tilted her head and said, "Vanessa's not trying to be pushy, Eliza. She just wants to belong." I blinked and never said she was being pushy. Dad nodded like he was diffusing a bomb. "Maybe just think about it. Okay, what would it hurt to help them a little?" I felt like I'd been slapped. All those years of showing up, of stepping in, of sacrificing, and now I was the one being difficult. They didn't see it, or maybe they did and just didn't care. Either way, something shifted that day. I started noticing how often I was the one cleaning up after dinners, running errands for the bakery, and covering shifts without complaint, and how often those gestures went unnoticed, unthanked. The resentment built slowly like water behind a dam, and just like water, it was starting to leak through the cracks. They called it a family meeting. But let's be real, this wasn't a meeting, it was an ambush. I got the text on a Wednesday afternoon, just 5 words from Dad, "Can you come by tonight?" No explanation, no smiley face, just that strange, overly formal tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I knew. I knew before I even parked in front of the house that something was off. When I walked into the living room, everyone was already there. Mom is on the couch, Dad pacing, Oliver standing by the window, Vanessa perched like a queen on the armrest, perfectly poised in a cream blouse and soft pink slacks, her serious conversation outfit. No one offered me a drink. No one smiled. "Hey," I said cautiously, "what's going on?" Oliver gestured toward the armchair. "Sit. We need to talk." I stayed standing. Dad cleared his throat like he was about to deliver a speech. "We've all noticed how tense things have been lately," he began, "and it's affecting the whole family. We're hoping we can find a compromise." I blinked. A compromise about what? That's when Vanessa stood up and walked over, her expression gentle, performative. "Eliza, we're not here to attack you. We want to have an honest conversation about the trust fund." I laughed. I actually laughed. "Are you serious again?" Oliver spoke next, his voice low and strained. "Look, we get it. It's technically yours, but this wedding, our future, it's important. We're not asking for all of it, just a portion. Enough for a down payment, maybe some of the honeymoon." I stared at him. "You're asking me to give up my inheritance for your wedding?" Vanessa interrupted, eyes shining with false sincerity. "Not give up? Share. You'd still have most of it, and it would mean the world to us." I looked to Mom and Dad, hoping, still stupidly hoping that one of them would say, "This is too much." But Mom just folded her hands. "We know this is hard, sweetie, but think about it. Isn't family worth more than money?" That's when something in me cracked. I stood there, looking at these people, my family, and realized they weren't seeing me at all. Not the daughter who took care of Mom through chemo, not the one who kept the bakery afloat when Dad had his hernia surgery, not the sister who skipped college so Oliver could go out of state without student debt. They saw a checkbook, a walking, breathing financial solution. "Let me get this straight," I said, voice shaking. "You're all here to convince me to give part of a trust fund I can't even access yet, one that was left to me by Grandpa, with clear legal conditions, so you two can have your dream wedding in a house you can't afford on your own?" No one answered. "I've said no, politely, repeatedly, and you didn't respect that. You brought it up again and again, and now this?" I looked at Oliver. "You set this up like an intervention." He had the decency to look ashamed. Vanessa didn't. "It's not about the money, Eliza. It's about showing us that we matter to you, that you believe in our future." My laugh turned hollow. "Vanessa, I barely know you." Her eyes narrowed. "Wow, so that's what this is about. You don't want your brother to be happy." "Don't twist this," I snapped. "This isn't love, this is manipulation." Then Mom chimed in, soft but firm. "Maybe you should stop being so rigid. Sometimes we have to sacrifice for the people we love." I turned to her slowly. "You mean like I did when I gave up college? When I ran the bakery so you could rest? When I stayed here for 10 years while Oliver got to chase his dreams and come home to applause?" She flinched. Vanessa stepped in again, but I held up my hand. "Don't. You've made your position very clear." I turned to Dad. "Are you really okay with this?" He sighed. "I just want peace in this family." "Peace," I repeated. "You want peace at my expense." I picked up my purse. This isn't a family meeting, it's a shakedown. Oliver stepped forward. Eliza, please, don't do this. I looked at him, my baby brother, and felt something break. You did this, Oliver. You let her turn this into a campaign. You sold me out because it was easier than telling her no. And then I walked out. I barely made it to the car before the tears came, hot, bitter, relentless. I sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes, gasping like I'd run a marathon. Not because I was angry, because I was grieving. That night, something died in me. Whatever thread had tied me to them, loyalty, guilt, love, it snapped. After that night, something inside me caved in. It wasn't an explosion, no screaming, no throwing things, just silence. A kind of hollowness that followed me home, settled into my bones, and didn't leave. I barely remembered driving back from my parents' house. I just recall gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The words, "It's not about money, it's about family," echoing in my skull like a curse. I didn't sleep, I couldn't. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between breaths, trying to remember how it felt to not be this angry, this hurt. In the morning, I called the bakery and said I wasn't coming in. No explanation, just, I need some time. I spent the next 4 days in my apartment, drifting between sleep and wakefulness like a ghost. I didn't eat much. I didn't shower until day 3. The smell of old coffee and leftover anxiety clung to my skin like smoke. My phone buzzed constantly. Mom, Oliver, Vanessa, even people I hadn't spoken to in months. Cousins, old neighbors suddenly wanted to check in. I ignored them all. At first, I thought I was just tired. Then I realized I was grieving. Grieving the version of my family I thought I had. How do you move forward when the people who raised you, the ones you sacrificed everything for, sit across from you and ask you to betray yourself? I thought about the years I spent helping my mom through chemo, the way I canceled plans with friends to drive her to appointments, slept in hospital chairs, and taught myself how to balance bakery ledgers when Dad's blood pressure spiked. I gave up scholarships, relationships, and entire dreams to be there for them. And when I finally had something of my own, something my grandfather left me because he saw how much I gave, they tried to take that too. It felt like theft, not just for money, but for recognition of worth. On the 5th day, I finally opened the curtains. The light hurt. It always does when you've lived in the dark too long. That same afternoon, I got a knock on the door. It was Rena, holding a bag of takeout and a bottle of wine. She didn't say much, just set it all down and pulled me into a hug. I figured you wouldn't cook, she said, handing me chopsticks. We sat in silence on my floor, eating pad thai out of cartons. You don't have to talk, she added after a while, but when you're ready, I'm here. I nodded, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. That was the first time I cried since the ambush. Not sobbing, just a quiet leak, like my body couldn't hold it anymore. The next few days were a slow climb. I forced myself to shower, to put on real clothes. I made scrambled eggs and actually ate them. I went for a walk, bought a new plant I wasn't sure I'd keep alive. One morning, I opened the drawer that held my old sketch pads, the ones I hadn't touched in over a year. Inside were designs for a bakery/art studio, a place I dreamed of opening since I was 19. I flipped through the pages, fingers tracing the ink lines of hand-drawn furniture layouts, light fixtures, and mural ideas. That's when something clicked. They could doubt me, they could betray me, but they couldn't erase who I was or what I was capable of building. That night, I wrote down every horrible thing I'd been told in the last month, every passive-aggressive comment, every guilt trip, every fake just checking in message. I printed screenshots of texts from Vanessa, some of them borderline manipulative, and filed them in a folder labeled, Rena helped me scan it all. You're building a case, she said. Not against them, I replied, for me. In the middle of all this, I found out from my cousin Mara that Vanessa had been calling around, telling people I was having a breakdown and that my behavior was erratic. She even hinted that I might not be mentally fit to manage an inheritance. That was the final straw. I didn't send a cease and desist, not yet. But I did schedule a meeting with a lawyer. I wanted to know exactly what protections the trust fund had, what my rights were, what my options be if this continued. The lawyer, Rebecca, was sharp, calm, and kind. She read over the trust terms and said firmly, "They have no legal standing. This money is yours. Period." That shouldn't have made me cry, but it did because finally someone was on my side. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. There's a moment in every storm when the wind dies, just enough for you to hear yourself think. That moment had come, and I wasn't going to waste it. Of course, healing wasn't linear. There were still bad days. Mornings when I'd scroll through social media and see photos of Oliver and Vanessa smiling at brunch with mutual friends who never asked me for my side. Afternoons when I'd almost call my mom just to hear her voice, then remember how quickly she'd dismiss mine. Nights when I'd open old family albums and wonder how the hell we ended up here. But the difference now was this: I stopped blaming myself. I stopped rehearsing comebacks in the shower or justifying why I'd said no. I stopped second-guessing why I was overreacting, because I wasn't. What I was doing was surviving and then slowly reclaiming. Every cup of tea I brewed, every email I answered, every time I said no without explaining myself, those were victories. Small ones, maybe, but they were mine. And I had a feeling that soon I'd be ready for more. Bigger steps, louder truths, the kind that didn't just defend me, but reminded me who I really was. Because no matter what they said, no matter how many people they tried to turn against me, I knew the truth. And the truth was finally enough. The first time I felt strong again came in the most unexpected place, at a thrift store. I'd gone there with no real purpose, just a need to be anywhere that wasn't my apartment or the bakery. I wandered through racks of mismatched furniture, old picture frames, and vintage lamps. That's when I saw a chipped wooden sign that read, "Breathe, begin again." I stood there staring at it for a long time. It cost $2. I bought it. It now hangs above my desk. That sign was the beginning. Of what? I wasn't sure. But it reminded me that healing isn't about fixing everything at once. It's about finding one thing, just one, that you can reach for, hold on to it, and then take the next step. So I started rebuilding quietly, privately. I created a new routine, woke up at 7 a.m., made tea, and journaled for 10 minutes. No screens until after breakfast. I deleted social media apps from my phone. It wasn't worth the emotional landmines. I called my lawyer again and asked for help drafting a formal boundary statement. We sent it to Oliver and Vanessa through the proper channels. It wasn't aggressive, just firm. I would not be participating in any further discussions about the trust fund. Any attempts to harass, guilt, or manipulate me would be documented. No exceptions. That alone brought relief I didn't know I needed. Next came therapy. I found a woman named Camille, warm, sharp, and brutally honest. In our second session, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. Why does everyone else's comfort matter more than your peace? I didn't have an answer, but I knew that was where I had to begin. With Camille's help, I unpacked the years of quiet resentment I had buried under being the good daughter. The way I said yes, even when it hurt. The way I equated sacrifice with love. The way I'd allowed myself to be erased because I thought that made me strong. It didn't. What makes me strong isn't endurance. It's clarity. It's the decision to choose myself even when no one else will. By month 2, I'd gone back to the bakery, but only part-time. I kept my distance and stuck to inventory and supplier calls. No family dinners, no shared lunch breaks. Mom tried to bridge the gap a few times, left cookies on my desk, sent photos of Oliver's childhood drawings. I didn't respond. It wasn't out of cruelty, I just wasn't ready. Meanwhile, something else was brewing. That storefront I saw back in part 5, the one near the park, I walked by it again. This time I stopped and took photos, looked up the realtor, asked about the lease. Turns out it had been sitting empty for nearly a year. The owner was offering a discount for small business tenants who had community-focused plans. I submitted a proposal, not just a bakery, a community cafe and creative space, a spot for artists, freelancers, and locals to gather, sip coffee, share work, and host workshops. A space where I could blend my two loves, food and art. I called it Second Rise. The name was obvious to anyone who's ever baked bread, but to me it meant more. It meant rebirth. It meant I was done letting people shrink me. Rena helped me write the mission statement. Camille reviewed the boundaries section in my business charter. My lawyer made sure the funding structure met all trust requirements. I applied for permits, sourced equipment, and held tasting events with friends who believed in me more than my own family had. It was exhausting and exhilarating. Some nights, I'd collapse into bed with dough still on my arms and paint on my shirt, but I'd smile. For the first time in a long time, the exhaustion was mine, earned. People started to notice. Customers from the bakery would recognize me and say, "I heard you're opening your own place, good for you." Some even shared how they'd felt uncomfortable with how my family handled things, but didn't know how to speak up. One woman, a teacher I hadn't seen since high school, looked me in the eyes and said, "You stood your ground. That matters." I didn't expect to become anyone's symbol, but maybe surviving out loud helps someone else feel less alone. The closer I got to launch day, the louder the whispers became. My mom showed up unannounced one afternoon while I was painting the front window. She stood outside holding a bag of lemon bars. I didn't open the door. I watched from behind the counter as she stood there for several minutes, then finally left. She placed the bag on the doorstep and disappeared. Inside was a note. "I don't know how we got here, but I'm proud of you, Mom." I sat on the floor and stared at that note for a long time. I didn't cry, not because I didn't feel something, but because I was finally learning that I didn't owe anyone access to the parts of me they once ignored. I'm not sure what will happen with Oliver or Vanessa or even my parents, but I know what's happening to me. I'm rising. And this time, I won't be quiet about it. I arrived before sunrise, nervous energy pulsing through my limbs. The air still smelled like fresh paint and vanilla from the last test batch. I walked the floor slowly, checking tables, rearranging chairs by instinct, straightening the community board by the door. Every small action felt like a declaration. I made this. People started lining up before 9. Friends, strangers, some I recognized from the bakery, some from therapy groups, a few curious locals who had seen the flyers. Rena handled the register, I manned the espresso machine. We laughed, we cried, someone brought flowers. Another brought a sketch of the building and handed it to me saying, "This place already feels like home." I stood behind the counter at noon and looked out at the packed space. There were no speeches, no ribbon cutting, just music, warmth, and the smell of fresh scones. And for once, I didn't think about who wasn't there. Didn't wonder what Oliver or Mom or Vanessa would have said. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just living. And that was more than enough. As I locked the doors that night, I looked at my reflection in the glass, tired, flour smudged, smiling. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally knew I was enough, just as I was. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The invitation came in the form of a glossy, cream-colored envelope and slid under my apartment door like it had just blown in on a breeze. I recognized the calligraphy instantly. Vanessa's signature flair. Dramatic, curated, perfect. It was for their engagement party, not a wedding, not yet. A last-ditch attempt to salvage something before the facade crumbled, I guessed. The event was at a rented vineyard just outside town. Formal dress, RSVP required. And I stared at it for a full minute before laughing. Loud, real, cathartic. They still thought I'd show up. They still thought I'd care. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on what mattered, my cafe. Second Rise had become more than a business. It was a sanctuary. Every day brought in more new faces, more warm feedback, more validation I hadn't known I was craving. We hosted our first open mic night, and a teenage girl read a poem about survival that made me tear up behind the espresso machine. "This place saved me," she whispered after and hugged me like she meant it. That was the moment I knew this was the legacy I wanted, not being the good daughter, not the bankroller of someone else's fantasy wedding, but the builder of safe spaces. And still, life had more twists in store. 2 weeks after ignoring the engagement party invite, I received an email from a local journalist. She'd heard whispers about my story, about the family drama, the inheritance, the new business, and wanted to do a piece on resilience and reinvention. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to make it a tabloid tale, but she assured me the angle would be focused on entrepreneurship, on turning adversity into art. She even said, "We don't need names, just your voice." So I said yes. The article went live the following Monday. Within hours, my inbox exploded. Messages from other women, some strangers, some distant acquaintances telling me how much they saw themselves in my story, how they too had been expected to set themselves on fire to keep others warm, how they too had finally chosen themselves. Then came the phone call. "Did you really have to air our dirty laundry in public?" Is Oliver. His voice was brittle, less angry than embarrassed. "You and Vanessa made this public the moment you tried to turn the family against me," I replied calmly. "I just told my story, no one's name was mentioned. You didn't have to make it sound like we were monsters." "I didn't," I said. "I didn't have to. Your actions spoke for themselves." He went quiet, then hung up. I thought that would be the end of it, but of course, it wasn't. A week later, I got a notification. Vanessa had posted a lengthy Instagram story. It was clearly about me, though she never used my name. Words like betrayal, narcissist, and unsupportive family were sprinkled throughout. She posed with Oliver, teary-eyed, clutching his hands. The caption, "Not everyone in your bloodline is rooting for you. Choose your real ones." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. That week, the cafe hosted a community panel on financial boundaries and generational trauma. I spoke on it alongside a local therapist and a small business lawyer. We answered questions, shared insights, laughed, cried. The room was packed. The same journalist showed up again, this time to take photos for a follow-up piece. Nessa's post got 200 likes. The panel was reprinted in 3 newsletters and 1 national blog. Oliver messaged me again, this time with just 1 line. "I didn't know it would go this far." I never replied. But then came the twist I didn't expect. A woman came into the cafe one afternoon, mid-30s, designer handbag, sunglasses indoors. She ordered a latte, then lingered near the pastry case. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked softly. I blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I'm Vanessa's cousin. I was at the dinner when she first brought up your trust fund." My stomach tightened. "I just wanted to say..." She lowered her glasses. Her eyes were sincere. "I knew it was wrong. I said so." She didn't like that. "We haven't spoken in months." She paused. "But you? What you've built here, it's real. I hope you know that." She left before I could even thank her. That night, as I closed up shop, I finally felt it, vindication. Not the loud, vengeful kind, but the kind that settles in your chest like warm tea on a cold day. because the best revenge was never about tearing them down. It was about building something so whole, so rooted, so undeniably mine that their noise couldn't touch it. A few days after Vanessa's cousin visited the cafe, I received a certified letter at home. For a split second, I feared it might be another legal stunt, but it wasn't. It was from my grandfather's old attorney, the one who'd managed the trust fund. Inside was an update. The final clause of the trust was approaching. In less than a year, I would have full access. No more conditions, no more restrictions. Just mine. But there was more. Apparently, my grandfather had left a sealed letter that was only to be opened once I reached this final stage of the trust. They'd been holding on to it for years, and now they were forwarding it to me. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. His handwriting was shaky, but familiar. "Dear Eliza," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've made it. On your own terms." That was the point. I saw early on that you were the one who held the most responsibility, the most silence, and the most strength. I knew people would try to take pieces of you. That's why I locked the door and gave you the key, not them. I cried reading that, not because I needed his validation, but because, after everything, someone had seen me, really seen me, even if they were gone now. And somehow that changed everything. I had nothing left to prove. When the next family dinner invite came, some new holiday gathering, I declined without guilt. I sent a polite message, no drama, no accusations, just, "I won't be attending, please respect my boundaries." And that was it. No backlash, no begging, just silence. The kind that says they finally got the message, and I was already moving forward. A week later, the cafe received a nomination for a Small Business Resilience Award. I hadn't even applied. Someone in the community had done it for me. When the official post went up online, it included a photo of me behind the counter, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, smile wide, and unbothered. Vanessa saw it. I know, because she unfollowed the cafe account that same day. Later that evening, I looked around Second Rise, the hanging plants, the tables scuffed with stories, the little chalkboard sign near the register that read, "You are exactly where you need to be." And I realized something. They tried to turn me into a cautionary tale, but I became a blueprint instead. That is how you reclaim a name. That is how you rise. And I'm just getting started. Hadn't heard from Oliver in months. After Vanessa's Instagram implosion and my quiet refusal to rejoin the family orbit, things had gone blissfully silent. My boundaries, once bulldozed by guilt and expectation, finally held firm. I was busy expanding Second Rise, new hours, a hired manager, and a weekend brunch menu. My days were full in the best way. So when my phone lit up with a call from Mom, I hesitated. We hadn't spoken since the letter. I let it go to voicemail. An hour later, a text from my dad came through. "Your mother's worried. Can we meet for lunch? Just us, no drama." I stared at the screen. Could have been a trap. But something in me, curiosity maybe, said yes. We met at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Familiar territory, a place with bad coffee and good pie. Dad was already there when I arrived, reading the menu like it was newsprint. He looked older. "Hi, Eliza," he said. "Hey," I replied, sliding into the booth. He didn't speak right away, just nodded at the waitress for 2 coffees, then folded his hands. "Your mother and I wanted to talk to you about things," he started. I raised an eyebrow. "Things?" Oliver, the wedding, the trust. There it was. I sat back. "I'm listening." He sighed, long and heavy. "We got it wrong. All of it. We let Vanessa twist things. We thought we were keeping the peace, but really, we were enabling her." I didn't say anything. I wanted him to sit with that truth. "She's gone now," he added. "Vanessa. She moved out a month ago. Wedding's off." That surprised me. I kept my face still. "Oliver's a mess," Dad said. "But he's starting to see it too. He asked us to reach out." And And we want to fix things, he said simply. Not because we expect anything, not because of the trust, just because you're our daughter. I studied him. This wasn't a demand. It was the first real apology. But I wasn't about to fall into old habits. What does fixing things look like to you? I asked. Whatever you're willing to offer, he said, even if it's just lunch once in a while. That made me pause. A crack of sunlight, cautious but possible. I'll think about it, I said. That afternoon, I walked back to Second Rise and stood at the threshold for a long time before going in. Was it safe to soften? Could I let go without giving in? Over the next few weeks, I allowed small things, a text from mom and a quick call with dad. But I kept boundaries clear. Then one morning, Oliver showed up. Not dramatic, not smug, just tired. Can I come in? He asked. I nodded, guarded. He sat at a corner table and ordered nothing. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said. I just wanted to say sorry, really sorry. I folded my arms. It took you long enough. I know, he said. I let Vanessa use me as a mouthpiece. I let her pit us against each other. I was weak. You were complicit. He nodded. That too. A long silence stretched between us. Then he added, I miss my sister. And for the first time in years, I believed him. We talked, not about trust, not about the past, just about books, coffee, and small stuff. He left after an hour, and I didn't feel hollow afterward. I felt lighter. A week later, he dropped off a box. Inside was the engraved cake knife from our parents' wedding, something I'd loved as a child and always expected Vanessa would take. His note said, "This belongs with you. You're the one who kept the family from breaking completely." That night, I placed it in the cafe's display case, a quiet reminder of survival, not surrender. Summer rolled in slow and golden. Business at Second Rise boomed with the heat, people seeking iced lavender lattes, a shade under the cafe's striped awning, a safe place to linger. We hosted community sketch nights, poetry brunches, and a few acoustic sets. One of our regulars proposed in the corner booth. I gave them a free cheesecake and cried in the back office. In all of it, there was peace. But peace didn't mean passivity. I didn't forget what had been said, what had been done. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't a blank check. It was a process, one I controlled. So when mom invited me to a small family dinner, just the four of us, nothing fancy, I paused, then agreed on one condition. It would be at my cafe, after hours. Neutral ground, my rules. She hesitated, but said yes. That night, they came. Mom brought her famous garlic bread. Dad looked nervous. Oliver brought tulips. We ate, simply, talked softly. And then, as coffee was served, I stood. I need to say this out loud, I began, so there's no confusion. They looked up. I'm not the same person I was a year ago. I'm not here to be the fixer or the forgotten one or the backup plan. Mom's eyes welled. I want a relationship, but only if it's based on respect, not guilt. If I feel those old patterns creeping back, I'll walk away, no apologies. A beat passed. Then Dad nodded. We understand. And for once, I believed they meant it. We cleared dishes in silence. But it wasn't the brittle kind. It was peaceful. After they left, I sat alone at the front table, barefoot, sipping leftover red wine from a mug. The city buzzed outside. Inside, it was still. They fun. Weeks later, a young woman stopped me outside the cafe. She was maybe 20, nervous, holding a notepad. Are you Eliza, the owner? I nodded. I just wanted to say, your story helped me. I read the article. I'm estranged from my family too. It's messy, but seeing someone come out the other side. She trailed off, eyes bright. I smiled. It's still messy, but yes, I'm on the other side. She thanked me. We hugged. And in that moment, I realized what my story had become. Not a scandal, not a tragedy, but a roadmap for anyone clawing their way out of manipulation, guilt, or silence. I had not just survived, I had turned pain into purpose. And for once, I wasn't looking back. I was exactly where I needed to be, still rising. And maybe for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. 6 months later, I stood at the edge of a farmer's market stall, sunlight on my back, coffee in hand, and realized this was it. Not a grand ending, but a quiet beginning. Second Rise had just been named one of the top 10 community cafes in the state. We'd expanded to host workshops for local teens, writing, painting, and resume building. One of our baristas started her own pop-up bakery using our kitchen on Sundays. The shop felt alive in ways I never imagined when I first opened. My relationship with my parents? Not perfect, but honest. We saw each other once a month. No expectations, no guilt trips, just people trying. And sometimes trying was enough. Oliver and I weren't best friends, but we texted, shared memes. He brought me a book last week and said, "This felt like you." That was more meaningful than any apology. As for the trust fund, it was unlocked on my 30th birthday. No parties, no announcements. I quietly withdrew enough for a down payment on a small building near the cafe. Plans were underway for a co-op art space and a mentorship hub. The rest, I left it growing. I didn't need to prove anything by spending it fast. One evening, I found myself cleaning the chalkboard by the register when a little girl tapped the glass. She waved. Her mom smiled behind her. Someone new to the neighborhood. They'd become regulars. I wrote on the board, "You belong here." That had become our motto. Later that night, I sat on the cafe's roof with a blanket and wine, watching the skyline shimmer. The air was warm, buzzing with life. I thought about the woman I was 2 years ago. Tired, cornered, afraid to be called selfish just for saying no. She would be proud of this version. This woman wasn't harder. She was clearer. She didn't seek approval, she set boundaries. She didn't chase love, she cultivated peace. And above all, she never handed over the pen again. Her story was hers to write. Still is, still will be. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail, handwritten, thick with emotion. It's from Vanessa. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside, she rambled, said she'd been in therapy. She finally understood what she'd done, how she'd weaponized her charm, how she'd thought of people as stepping stones instead of souls. She said I didn't owe her a response, just that she wanted me to know she was sorry. I didn't reply, not because I hated her. However, closure doesn't always require dialogue. Sometimes it's a choice you make alone on a quiet rooftop with nothing but a sky full of stars to witness. I folded the letter and tucked it in a box with other things I no longer carried. And just like that, I felt lighter. One day, a reporter from a local paper stopped by, said someone had nominated me for a Women Rebuilding Community Spotlight. When she asked if I had anything I'd want others to know, I said, "Don't wait for permission to matter, you already do." That quote made it to print. A week later, a teenager left me a note on a napkin. It said, "Thank you for building a place where people like me feel seen." That one I framed. In the end, I didn't get revenge. I got something better. A life I chose. A peace I fought for. A truth that belonged only to me. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most radical kind of happy ending there is. Now, every time someone walks into the cafe and lingers a little longer, laughs a little louder, or picks up one of the books from the community shelf, I feel it. That full circle warmth. It doesn't erase the hard chapters, but it affirms the rewrite. Because healing isn't loud. It's consistent. It's quiet mornings and chosen families and knowing deep in your gut that you're finally okay. And for anyone out there wondering if they'll ever get here too, You will. Keep the pen in your hand. Your story isn't over yet. And in case no one's told you lately, you belong here too.